Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner, and welcome to tonight's edition of the Robust Opposition. I'm very pleased to have with me tonight my guest, Kevin Gosztola, who was last with me almost 2 years ago at the end of January 2020. The title of that show was Will the DNC Screw Bernie Again? And it was based on an article he had written for the Gray Zone. We all know how that turned out, but we're not going to be discussing that tonight. Tonight, we're going to be discussing whether Joe Biden is continuing the policies of Obama and Trump to prosecute journalists under the Espionage Act. And we're going to get into that by talking about the Julian Assange case. Because Julian Assange was just on International Human Rights Day, of all things. The British High Court just ruled that he can be extradited to the United States to be tried for espionage. But before we get to that case, I want Kevin to tell the viewers how he got started in journalism and what particularly interests him about these kinds of cases.
Thanks for having me back on. I started doing journalism while I was in college, but I don't have a degree in journalism. I just decided to pursue it because I was generating a following in the early days of blogging. I was involved in some Bush administration era activism while I was in college. So I was following the anti-war protests against the Iraq War. And I was somewhat engaged in Democratic Party politics, but not very. I was just following it like the average person does in this country. And I decided that I wanted to be serious about pursuing this. I had an internship at The Nation magazine. That was a huge deal. I got to work under Greg Mitchell, and I was there at a formidable time when WikiLeaks was putting out all of these publications, and Chelsea Manning had made the disclosures that are being criminalized for a second time through this case against Julian Assange. And from January 2011 through to June 2011, I was in New York. I was following a lot of remarkable events, including the media partnerships that Assange and WikiLeaks had with the release of the U.S. diplomatic cables. And then after that, I decided that I wanted to continue this work. I was hired by a producer who started a blog, and the project was Fire Dog Lake. And I was there for a time and brought on board eventually in a position to be the civil liberties, national security journalist that they had that published a regular column. And then about a little more than 5 years ago now, about 6 years ago, it spun off and I formed shadowproof.com. And I've been very serious about following the war on whistleblowers. At that time, back in 2011, that site, which I call FDL in shorthand, was covering Chelsea Manning's case, was following the abuse that was happening to her, the torture that was happening to her at the Quantico Marine Brig. I continued to follow WikiLeaks and Chelsea Manning. I became one of the few journalists to go to Fort Meade and cover every single pretrial hearing and every single day of her her trial that took place in 2013. That was a summer event that took place from early June all the way to mid-August. And then I followed what happened to her while she was imprisoned at Fort Leavenworth. And I stayed on top of this along with other whistleblower cases that we'll be talking about tonight. And just being the fact that I covered Chelsea Manning, it's natural that I would stay engaged and follow Julian Assange's case closely. So I come to this with a full understanding of this case that faces Julian Assange because I know the case that the military brought against Chelsea Manning.
Well, for those people who aren't familiar with Julian Assange, although I imagine most people watching this show are, tell us what he did, what he was accused of, why you feel it was unjust, and how he's been treated up until this point.
Julian's accused of leaking, of publishing leaked documents that violate the U.S. Espionage Act. And this is a dangerous escalation because up to this point, the Justice Department had a kind of informal boundary that they didn't cross, sort of an unspoken agreement within prosecutorial circles that while they would pursue whistleblowers without any hesitation and target them with the Espionage Act, they would not go after a journalist. But through this case, because of how Julian Assange has been widely viewed and depicted by government officials, they don't have any hesitation in going after him and setting a precedent, a potential precedent in this country through a trial that would change the very dynamic of journalism, of national security journalism in particular in the United States. Because if they are able to convict Julian Assange, then they would always have this as a marker that would exist in order to control what news publications and especially independent journalists are able to publish, get away with publishing. It would narrow the First Amendment rights that we have. It would jeopardize and send a message globally to other countries that there are limits they can impose on news reporters when it comes to national security and I'd say military stories, because these are the documents that are at issue. The documents particularly targeted are Afghanistan War Logs, they're Iraq War Logs. These are military incident reports that covered the day-to-day actions that are taking place on the ground. They're historical documents. They didn't contain troop movements or anything like coordinates which could be used by groups to attack soldiers in real time. They just showed where like improvised explosive devices were being set off, or they were complaints, or they were soldiers logging complaints and allegations of torture and abuse in detention camps, for example, things of that nature. When soldiers were reportedly killed in action, or when an alleged enemy was killed in action, it would be logged in those. And so you have a full picture of what was going on in the Afghanistan War, a full picture of what was going on in the Iraq War. These documents are being criminalized. State Department diplomatic cables are being criminalized, the publication. They're going after Julian Assange and WikiLeaks for publishing Guantanamo files, which were assessments of each of the detainees, the prisoners that were held under the war on terrorism, first under Bush, then Obama. Many of them released. We're down to a little more than 40, I believe, in the prison. But these files showed the reasons why the government felt they had the justification to keep these people in a military prison. He's being targeted for distributing these files. The general allegations criminalized him. And there's one computer crime charge thrown in there for good measure to help them depict Julian Assange as some kind of a hacker and not a journalist. It's very deliberate what they're doing. They put this in there so that they can make it seem like he's not deserving of press freedom protections.
Now, do you think that that's the reason that a lot of the mainstream corporate media are not supporting him, that they're saying, oh, he's not really a journalist, he's a hacker? Wasn't there also a charge that he instructed his sources how to cover up what they did? Or do you think it's really more that he exposed what was going on with the Hillary campaign and the DNC leaks?
I believe it's a little bit of both. I mean, it's hard to read minds, right? I don't know exactly. They don't honestly come out and say why they believe what they believe about this case. At least I'm thinking of a very salient example recently that a lot of people have been able to view, where Morning Joe, Joe Scarborough, during this clip, he says a bunch of things about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks in this case that are false, not based in fact. former Democratic Senator Claire McCaskill responds, says a bunch of things that aren't true, not based in fact. I mean, it's not really clear why they believe what they believe, but I think it's likely a combination that they have heard all of the disgust from U.S. national security agencies. They've read the alleged threat assessments of WikiLeaks. They know the viewpoint that is held, and they think there's some legitimacy to it. But then they also have their own political viewpoint that comes from them being associates culturally of media pundits and being associates of people in political circles who loathe the fact that Julian Assange exposed them to scrutiny. And that's where I think the issue with the Podesta emails, the Clinton campaign emails come into play, even though those aren't even a part of the criminal case. The emails from the Clinton campaign are not even at issue when it comes to this extradition. We're talking about documents from more than 10 years ago now that received the publication of these, by the way, resulted in awards for a lot of these media organizations. And so most of this wasn't that big of a deal. In fact, it's really important to note that when Secretary of Defense Robert Gates was responding to the uproar from people, particularly involving the diplomatic cables, he said that the reaction was significantly overwrought because he took the view that is held by most people in the US government. He said the United States, I'm paraphrasing, but it essentially was the US is an indispensable nation. And so countries will always have to deal with us. So they may be unhappy about what they read in diplomatic cables, but in a short amount of time, they're going to come back and work with us. And so I don't think the publication of these materials will do permanent damage to the United States' ability to conduct diplomacy and engage in whatever efforts it has around the world. And that's proven to be true. That's exactly true. That was the reasonable way to react to the documents. And, if you want to be very cynical and jaded about all of them, you can look at these different sets of documents that Julian Assange is being punished for releasing to the public and say very disappointingly, nothing changed. There's not really much you can point to in the way of reforms. Unfortunately, they did not meet the kind of success that Edward Snowden's whistleblowing met. In the fact that there isn't a piece of legislation you can hold up and show as a result of the fallout from the whistleblowing. There's a USA Freedom Act that passed in Congress and was signed into law. And even if that's just modest and a meager kind of reform and still left intact a lot of the surveillance state, it still represented a political response to something that was righteous. But there's nothing in the way of that with Chelsea's whistleblowing and these disclosures. It didn't result in, well, there's a very small little example related to the Iraq War. But as far as the Afghanistan War, it didn't shorten it. We still had 10 more years of the Afghanistan War and occupation. And it hasn't changed the nature of the way we conduct diplomacy. It's still as secretive as ever.
Now, go back to when he first left to seek refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy and talk about how he was supposedly fleeing rape charges and how now it's come out that a lot of those women were kind of forced to charge him. And that was totally bogus.
Yeah. So the allegations that were brought against him were never official rape charges. It was always that the Swedish prosecution authority was investigating these allegations. And it was the position of his legal team that this was a kind of pretext, that the fact that they were holding this over him was intended to bring Julian Assange to Sweden because the U.S. wanted Sweden to have this charge against Assange. And then either they would be comfortable with tying him up in a sex crime case, or they might turn around and try to claim the ability to, well, they might try to extradite him from Sweden and bring him to the United States. And there were some theories that perhaps extradition from Sweden could be easier than the UK, although right now, it's not like they have fared terribly in trying to extradite him from the UK. If you're in the US government right now, it's looking fairly promising that you might be able to bring Julian Assange to the United States. But the Swedish prosecution authority committed a lot of due process violations, which are documented by former UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Niels Meltzer. And he dug into what was happening. I mean, they opened and closed this case into Julian Assange like 3 or 4 times, and they never brought charges. And they were demanding, because I think the US wanted them to, that he come to Sweden to answer questions when they had an agreement that allowed them to question him from the embassy over video. And these questions would have helped them determine whether they had grounds to charge him. And they kept putting it off and demanding that he come to Sweden. He entered the Ecuador embassy outlining a very clear case for why he deserved diplomatic asylum, and that was granted by President Rafael Correa. And Rafael Correa did a pretty good job of protecting and standing by Julian Assange until he was defeated or was replaced by a right-wing president, Lenin Moreno, who then coordinated and collaborated with President Donald Trump's administration in a pressure campaign that forced him out of the embassy. So this is a little bit of the background of how we got to here and why that. And the resolution of that Swedish case was basically that the prosecution authority backed off because the US is going to go after Julian Assange and bring him to the United States on the charges related to his journalism. So there was no need for that charge in Sweden anymore. So it just disappeared.
Right. Now, didn't I also hear that somehow they were bribed with a $10 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund?
Yeah, so in Ecuador, there were discussions about getting Julian Assange out of the embassy, and they were granted around this time. They it's not like they ever came out and said, we're giving you an IMF loan because you're going to help us get access to Julian Assange, or you're going to help us expel him. But they did grant them a loan, or help grant them a loan. And then that's about the same time that we saw, it wasn't long after that Julian Assange was booted from the embassy, put in handcuffs, and detained. He was, at that moment, picked up by British authorities on a bail jumping charge because both the UK and US refused to recognize the institution of diplomatic asylum. So going into the Ecuador embassy was seen as fleeing while you were accused of a crime. And so they kept that on the books on behalf of the US government. And then that's why he was put into Belmarsh high security prison immediately after he was dragged out of the Ecuador embassy. So, like when he was expelled, it wouldn't necessarily be an automatic that he would be imprisoned unless there was a criminal charge, a criminal pretext for arresting Julian Assange. But, obviously he never wanted to leave the embassy because he was afraid legitimately that the US was preparing a prosecution against him. So that's why he stayed there. And that's why for over 7 years, he had lack of sunlight. He lived in a kind of psychological torment. He didn't have access to the kind of medical care that he needed. A doctor even assessed him and did say to him at one point that this could be really dire for you if you don't go outside the embassy and get medical treatment. You should consider leaving. He had problems with his teeth that were terrible, and he had other issues with I think his bones and other things that needed attention, and he couldn't get that. There's no ability to bring in that equipment that was necessary to do that into the embassy. but he insisted that he stay in the embassy because the U.S. would target him.
Now, talk about how he's been treated in the Belmarsh prison, because things have deteriorated rapidly.
Yeah, that's largely owed to the fact that he's been kept in prison during this extradition case and has not been allowed to be out on home confinement, which is rather unfortunate as well as absurd. There are people who have had accusations against them of being involved in Al Qaeda, being linked to terrorism offenses, who have been given ankle bracelets and allowed to live outside of prison while they await their trial and find out if they're going to be convicted of any serious crimes. But meanwhile, Julian Assange, because of this bail jumping offense, has been treated as a flight risk at every stage. And even with this pandemic, even while making a case that he's medically vulnerable to the spread of the virus in prison, and prisons have been probably some of the worst places to be located during this pandemic with uncontrolled spread, and very few precautionary measures in a lot of these places. And that's the way it is in the US, but it's also the way it is in the UK as well. And so there have been outbreaks at Belmarsh, and even so, he's been unable to get a bail, unable to be granted bail so that he could be out on home confinement. And when he won his extradition case in January. That's why the U.S. government appealed. The judge did the U.S. government a favor by keeping him in Belmarsh during the appeal. And so he was not allowed out. And all of this has contributed because there's been lockdown conditions during the pandemic. He's been very isolated. This has taken a toll on him. Recently was reported that he had a mini stroke. I saw him. I was one of the journalists covering the case that day. Saw him in the video room that he was brought to at Belmarsh, and he could barely hold his head up, and he did not look good. He looked ill. And that day he had a mini stroke, and now he's on anti-stroke medication. And a lot of this is just hammered home the reality that what we're seeing is this long drawn out punishment by process, that even if somehow he manages to survive and not be brought to the US and put on trial, there are still at least 2 to 3 years left in this case, potentially, before the US runs out of options to try and get the Foreign Office to sign off on the extradition request and bring him to the United States. He can appeal to the Supreme Court in the UK, which is what they're going to do now. But they may not want to challenge the appeal court, since the appeals court ruling was signed off on by the Chief Justice. So they may decide they don't want to question that conclusion. Then they can try to go to the European Court of Human Rights, which the British government under Boris Johnson and other politicians have been trying to make entirely meaningless and make it so that British residents don't have to follow what the EU has to say about human rights laws. And then, so if he prevails there, maybe that provides some options. But if he doesn't, then it comes down to the political decision of a secretary in the Foreign Office, this Home Office, which signs off on the extradition request, is the same Home Office that receives the extradition request and makes the determination that it is valid enough to go before a district court. So there's a little bit of a feedback loop, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense that you would say, okay, they're going to, it's hard for me to get people to think that there's a chance that this person who is the secretary would reject the extradition request after approving it for the British courts to review. Right. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And, they're very thick as thieves, the US and the UK government. So I was actually kind of shocked when the initial barrister, in the lower court, where he won his case, and you have been covering this trial every day remotely. So you've seen. Can you talk about the first trial, and did you think it was fair? I'm pretty sure you assumed that it would be appealed, but I'm kind of interested in how the first trial was conducted versus the second trial, and what rationale did they use in the second trial to overturn the barrister?
Right. So we had the appeal hearing, and then there was a hearing in September of 2020 that the defense team, they're the ones that have the burden of showing that the extradition request should be rejected. So if you can show that the Crown Prosecution Service is not got a good case, then that's how you convince the court to block it. They were able to call witnesses to testify, and they focused on showing different things that could help the judge recognize that he is a journalist, that he's being retaliated against, that there's political motivations to this case, that there's medical and physical health issues that should prevent him from being further abused and extradited, that there are prison considerations, that in the US there are prisons that are inhumane and he would be mistreated if he was extradited. So a lot of that did end up working in Julian Assange's favor, at least when we're talking about the picture they presented of prisons, and also the medical health testimony. The mental health testimony played a big role in getting the judge to reject it. So that definitely resonated with her. But there was some unfairness to it in the sense that there's this indictment that was issued just a couple months before they even had these proceedings, and it introduced new allegations about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks that are intended to introduce an array of new character attacks against Julian Assange that are useful to prosecutors in making him seem like a hacker and not a journalist. And they targeted free speech, things he had said at conferences. They accused him of improper conduct or behavior when he helped Edward Snowden flee Hong Kong by sending a WikiLeaks associate or a WikiLeaks person to Hong Kong to fly with Edward Snowden. And of course, they became trapped in Moscow because, actually, Joe Biden was involved in this when he was in the Obama administration. But they went after that. They tried to link him to some of these hacks that were taking place in early 2010s that were very well publicized after the WikiLeaks disclosures. They tried to link him to hacks against Icelandic institutions. They introduced false, fabricated allegations from an individual named Ziggy Tordarson, who is a sociopath, actually convicted sociopath in Iceland, who is who became an informant, who tried to embezzle money from the WikiLeaks store, who's lied about his position in the organization, who is actually in jail right now because the Icelandic authorities had no choice but to put him in jail in order to stop him from committing further financial fraud schemes against companies. And he is just this incredible figure to see involved in the U.S. government's case. So anyways, they put this all together into an indictment, a third indictment that drops 2 months before this hearing. And the defense team demands that the judge give them some additional time to deal with these new allegations. And she says, no, we are not going to permit that. And so they go through this whole entire extradition hearing without being able to bring witnesses to address these new claims, without being able to introduce evidence that can address these new allegations. And those go unchallenged in her decision, and add to the way that she depicts Julian Assange as a criminal in her decision.
Now, you said in your article that his fate was really in the hands, and you referenced him earlier, this Lord Chief Justice Ian Barrett. And
Burnett,
sorry. And say why this Chief Justice is being a close friend of someone named Sir Alan Duncan is significant.
Yeah, so I got to give credit to Declassified UK, this journalism project in the United Kingdom. Matt Kennard and Mark Curtis co-authored this piece that detailed that this foreign official, this person who's part of the British government, had connections to people who were involved in tracking Julian Assange as he was expelled from the Ecuador embassy. He was in a room of one of these government offices, watching on video, smirking, excited about it. Burnett and this person, Duncan, that you name, were longtime friends. When he was in Parliament, because he was a parliamentarian, he called Julian Assange a miserable little worm. But these people are friends. They go back 40 years. And after this happened, after Julian Assange got tossed out of the embassy, he goes to Ecuador and he personally thanks President Lenin Moreno. He gives him a gift. I think it's a piece of porcelain. And he says, "Job well done." And this is the person who is a Chief Justice, was a close friend of this official who is very rabid in his opposition to Julian Assange. And we see no recusal. This Chief Justice was involved in reviewing this case. And I point out at the end of my article that he was not at the hearing where the verdict on the appeal was announced. This was read by another justice named Timothy Holroyd, who came out and gave a very, very brief summary. I mean, this was not very long at all. It took around 10 minutes or less that they even went through any of the details in the decision. And Chief Justice Ian Burnett was not there. And I can only guess why he wasn't there. There was no explanation for why he wasn't there, but we can see that he could have a severe conflict of interest that likely muddied his ability to be clear-eyed about this case.
Yeah. Now, it came out in this trial that the CIA attempted to kidnap Julian from the Ecuadorian embassy and assassinate him. This didn't surprise me, of course, from what we know about the CIA, but do you think that their reasons for doing so was that he is supposed to testify as a witness against them in cases being made in Germany, Spain, and also the International Criminal Court?
Well, I think it's because of what we know from the Yahoo News reporting, which I think was really solid. That was a big, major report to have out there in the establishment press, because it made very legitimate the narrative that I had been putting forward, that a lot of this originated from the CIA, that in fact they backed charging Julian Assange and they were pushing for the criminalization of Julian Assange. We saw Mike Pompeo calling WikiLeaks a non-state hostile intelligence agency. And he used his first speech as CIA director under Trump to call out WikiLeaks and to say a lot of venomous things about WikiLeaks, and a lot that was out there in the ether right then about how WikiLeaks is working for Russia and how Julian Assange is working for Russia. That has never been proven. And in fact, the CIA couldn't prove it, which is why in the Yahoo article, it says that they decided to just categorize it as a hostile entity rather than go after it for working as an agent of a foreign power. So I think it has to do with their vengeance. The reason why they were plotting against Julian Assange is laid out in that Yahoo News report, because WikiLeaks published a set of documents that are not at issue in this case, but very much upset the CIA to see them public. And these were Vault 7 materials that detailed the offensive cyber warfare capabilities of the CIA. They had a lot of similarity to the kinds of materials we had seen from Edward Snowden. Talked about how the CIA could plant malware, take over Samsung televisions, how they could disrupt and attack Apple iPhones, use exploits, different things, how they could target people's messaging apps like WhatsApp or Signal and use those to collect intelligence. And so this was something they weren't happy about. Mike Pompeo and others at the CIA believe that there was something unique about them in being able to dodge WikiLeaks. They laughed that State Department couldn't protect their documents. They were, they thought WikiLeaks was something that happens to the Pentagon. The Pentagon was not able to protect their documents, but there weren't CIA documents out there until one day, tens of thousands of documents appear, and WikiLeaks got a hold of them, and now they're embarrassed and ashamed. And Mike Pompeo doesn't want to go before Donald Trump and admit that they lost control of these files. So he has a very visceral reaction, and he spends much of his time until he becomes Secretary of State obsessed with going after Julian Assange. I think that's what leads to these sketches of plans to kidnap or kill Julian Assange, which I do think is actually, it's easy to say I'm not surprised given the history of the CIA targeting foreign government leaders and plotting assassinations back in the 60s and early 70s. And it's definitely a part of the history of the CIA to plot assassinations. But I think what's remarkable in this respect is that, we see them conjuring these different labels that they can apply to WikiLeaks so they can make it legal in order to go after. So it's a lot like the drone program. They know what they're doing, and they know that they got to find some way to mask it with words that seem like they're applying the rule of law. And so they want to call WikiLeaks things like a hostile entity, or they actually considered going after like Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras and labeling them information brokers. And so they're looking at maybe going after Julian Assange as an information broker. And then that way they can get around the idea that there's some kind of freedom of the press protection that they have to uphold.
Yeah, it's very Orwellian. It's like how Obama, to mask all the civilian casualties with the drone program, basically called any adult male over the age of 18 in the vicinity a combatant. So they were reclassified. They weren't civilians, and that minimized the civilians. Now, talk about the assurances that they gave at the trial that all these things would not happen, and why these assurances are BS. Because I heard Nils Meltzer, as you mentioned, the UN Special Rapporteur, in an RT interview, go through them one by one, and it seems like they're easily rebutted.
Yeah, it's not that hard. You can look at the different clauses that are in them and see where the loopholes are at. So for the one that stands out about Supermax prisons, they say Julian Assange will not be sent to a Supermax prison. And there's one in ADX Florence, Colorado. That's the one that's the most notorious. Which, by the way, I'm going to say something graphic here just so people can understand the nature of what goes on at those Supermax prisons. We're talking about a potential that Julian Assange could be put in a unit where people sink deeper and deeper into, pits of hell, so to speak, have some of their darkest thoughts, are trying to get out. They suffer the kind of isolation that leads their minds to be lost entirely. They feel lost within these facilities, and some of them have even taken the dramatic steps of eating shards of glass so that they can get out of these conditions. And they'd rather be receiving medical treatment in a hospital ward than in this H unit, or this unit within the Supermax prison. So it's severe, and it's the kind of thing we could expect to see happen with Julian Assange if he was put there. And in the assurance that relates to Supermax prisons, they say we would not hold him in pretrial or post-trial. Well, nobody is ever sent to a Supermax prison before trial, so that part of the assurance does not make any sense. But then post-trial, just because they say they won't send him there doesn't mean there aren't other options for isolating and dehumanizing Julian Assange. He can be sent to a communications management unit in Marion, Illinois, or Terre Haute, Indiana, which is where a lot of war on terrorism prisoners have been sent, or that's where Daniel Hale, drone whistleblower Daniel Hale, has been sent. And I'll set that aside. We may come back to it. But it also says that if Julian Assange commits a future act, that may trigger the need to designate him for a supermax prison. Well, what could that be? All a person has to do within any of the national security agencies is recommend to the Bureau of Prisons that there's some kind of threat that Julian Assange poses, like maybe they suspect there's going to be a publication of information coming from WikiLeaks, and they need to cut him off by putting him in a supermax prison. That's the same thing that goes for special administrative measures, which is usually said as SAMs. So SAMs are a set of restrictive confinement conditions that can be imposed on somebody who is accused of national security related offenses. U.S. security leaders like the CIA and others can recommend to the Attorney General that these be imposed, and they can come during pretrial or post-trial confinement. And right now, the alleged Vault 7 leaker is living under SAMs at a prison in New York City. So this is very real. And again, with that, they say if he commits a future act, like they say, we won't impose these, but if he commits a future act, we may impose SAMs. Well, what's that future act? There's really no notice in there of what that would be. There's no way Julian Assange can know how to not commit a future act and be designated for SAMs because they do not spell it out. Now, the other two are related to his mental and physical health care, and the fact that they say they will assign him a doctor if he's in prison. But this isn't really reasonable to take seriously because we have seen in the last few years journalism that has explored the Bureau of Prisons and the lack of mental health treatment that prisoners receive. They've claimed that they're going to do a better job, but what happens is someone like Julian Assange goes to a facility and they receive their intake examination where they look at you and they document your physical and mental state. And then they'll find ways to, basically downgrade you so that they do not have to provide care because they're short-staffed. They don't have a lot of doctors per prisoner. So only the most extreme cases are they going to give 24/7 around-the-clock attention, the kind of attention he's receiving right now at Belmarsh, which medical professionals there have determined he absolutely needs to be watched closely so that they can keep him from being in the state that he was during those first months after he came to Belmarsh. So there's that. And then the final one is a very meaningless pledge that they've made related to his potential transfer to Australia because he is an Australian citizen. So they've said there's a prisoner transfer agreement, or there's an agreement that allows people who are Australians who are convicted of crimes to go serve their sentences in Australia. And he could go serve his sentence there. He can apply for a transfer. But this is a largely meaningless thing. Anybody can apply. What about, will you grant this transfer to Australia? Or will Australia consent to receiving Julian Assange and holding him in one of their facilities? Those are questions that are not satisfied by those pledges. And in fact, we have a prior case involving a prisoner named, a defendant named David Mendoza, who was found guilty or was prosecuted for alleged drug trafficking and had millions of dollars in assets confiscated. He went through extradition proceedings in Spain, and the U.S. signed a contract that said he would be able to serve his sentence in Spain. And when he was in the United States and he applied for a prisoner transfer, they rejected that multiple times and would not grant it. And so this can happen in Julian Assange's case. The idea that they're saying we will give him the right to apply does not really mean anything because anybody can apply for a transfer.
Yeah, and also Nils Meltzer said that is only after he's exhausted all his appeals. So he could be in this U.S. prison for, 5 to 6 more years. Now this
right. Just to say quickly, what you're saying is, and that's an important point to make. If he applies for his transfer, he's basically giving up. He's accepting the outcome of his trial in the United States.
Oh, okay. And also talk about what Richard Medhurst uncovered regarding the U.S. violating the assurances they gave in the Hararti case.
Well, so that's what I was talking about with David Mendoza.
Oh,
so,
I thought it sounded like the same thing, but then I wrote down the name was Hararti.
Yeah, so his last name was Mendoza, and yeah, this was a really good piece of journalism that Richard did in the last couple of months or so here. And he got these documents, and yeah, it shows that the U.S. just brazenly violated their agreement.
Okay. Now, I know I said we were going to only go for 45 minutes, and we just got...
I was okay. I got time.
Okay, because I wanted to talk about some other famous whistleblowers. You know, I think most people know about Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning. There was that great documentary about it. But basically, Obama, and this goes even before Obama, but Obama has prosecuted more journalists and whistleblowers under this Espionage Act of 1917 than all presidents combined in the 100 years since it was enacted. Mm-hmm. And we all thought that that was pretty horrific for a constitutional lawyer and also the recipient of a Nobel Peace Prize. How did the government attorneys make the case that these activities were either not whistleblowing or not journalism, or that they went beyond whistleblowing and journalism? Because obviously it's unconstitutional to prosecute a whistleblower or a journalist. So they had to say that that's not what they were doing.
Well, what they're doing is they're innovating their prosecutorial powers in real time through these cases. Because what they've done is they've taken a law that is not the Official Secrets Act, which is to say that in the United Kingdom, there's actually a law that empowers prosecutors in Britain to punish journalism that involves the publication of national security secrets that they do not want to see in newspapers or publicized by media organizations. We don't have that here. We have a First Amendment. We have a Constitution. We have certain free speech rights that don't exist in the UK, where Julian Assange is being punished. And that punishment's coming at the behest of the U.S. government. Here, they took the Espionage Act and they completely morphed the intention and meaning of it in order to make it a strict liability crime. So what happens is a person signs up, or let's say they enlist in the military like Chelsea Manning, or they go and sign a contract and become a private security contractor for the Pentagon or the NSA, like Edward Snowden was a contractor. Yeah. And then you become somebody who work, like if you're in the CIA, you sign these agreements, you sign these non-disclosure agreements, and the act of signing that becomes an effective secrecy oath that they then use to go after you. And all they're doing in these cases is very basic. They've got it so that they don't really have to prove intent. They don't have to show harm. You don't have a public interest defense. You're not able to go during your trial before the judge and say why you disclosed these files and why you believed the public had a right to this information. It's even difficult for you to argue that there was improper classification because the judge doesn't want you to be able to argue and second guess these authorities that keep secrets classified. And this goes all the way back to Ellsberg, actually, because Daniel Ellsberg will say that he got to the point in his trial where he was wanting to say why he had revealed the Pentagon Papers to everybody, and the judge cut him off and said he could not answer that question. So this is the way it is in these cases, that these people who are being punished for revealing information to the press are not able to, in their trial, make a public interest defense.
Yeah.
And they've created it as such that it's very simple. All they show is that you agreed not to leak and release secrets, and then it automatically amounts to a felony. And then you get usually about, the average is actually more around 2 or 3 years in prison. Reality winner was the extreme. NSA whistleblower reality winner was an extreme, receiving more than 5 years. It was the longest sentence in prison ever for somebody accused of an unauthorized disclosure. But John Kiriakou had a plea agreement. It'll be the last one that the Justice Department ever inks, but he managed to get 30 months in Loretto, which was actually on the lower end of what they pushed for. Because now they're really trying to get somewhere around 6 to 10 years for these offenses. And that's what they'd want for Julian Assange. They probably want somewhere, although they say the maximum potential sentence for Julian Assange is 175 years. It's not likely to be that long, but it could be 10 to 20, which is still significant when you consider he's a 50-year-old person and could be in prison until he is 60, and that increased the likelihood that he would die in prison.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned the CIA non-disclosure agreement. So John Kiriakou, I think he was the first one to be indicted under the Espionage Act, and that was for revealing the waterboarding of Abu Zubaydah.
Yes. So, yeah, he was one of the first. Thomas Drake, NSA whistleblower, was charged. Yeah, it was before him charged. And that case collapsed. They tried to say a bunch about him that was provably false. They were successful, though, in destroying his life.
Yeah, and he's the one who was talking about this Trailblazer program.
Yeah, yes.
I'd like you to explain what they were, both of these men were trying to get out to the public, how they tried to go through channels first.
Yeah.
And how finally they were sort of forced, because, I mean, there was one case where, I think I wrote it down, they spoke to somebody in the Armed Services Committee. Well, let me look for it while you answer the question, if you don't.
Well, so essentially with Thomas Drake, he had other people who had left the NSA who were trying to expose this kind of private contractor boondoggle that existed, where Michael Hayden, who was director, had put a priority on this program that would collect data and violate privacy and wouldn't work as well as the program they had developed, which would make considerations that related to the First Amendment and Constitution. And so you had this, this corporatism, so to speak, that was happening and infecting the NSA, and is still that way today, presumably. And that contributed to this disaffection, the fact that he turned and went to an inspector general. But the inspector general for this office basically passed their names to the Justice Department, and then they wound up being put under a microscope and facing prosecution. They had their homes raided. These people who I'm describing, including Thomas Drake, ended up later being targeted. At first, it was Bill Binney, who was an NSA whistleblower, who really got targeted. But then later on, they believe that Thomas Drake is the one exposing warrantless wiretapping to the press, although that was not the case. So they believe that he's more important than. He still did something important, but they think he's involved in something that he's not. So they're trying to go after him. And they do bring this case against him, which ends up collapsing, but it did a lot of damage to him. And as far as John Kiriakou's case, he just does an interview on ABC confirming that waterboarding exists. It's happening. The Bush administration is doing it. It's official policy to engage in waterboarding against war on terror detainees. And that it's wrong. He says, I am opposed to it. His fuller story now is that he's refused to be trained in waterboarding these people. And he does this on ABC News, and that leads to a campaign to try and find something that they can charge him with. They don't find anything. And he mostly is doing all right. He even works for Senator John Kerry in this time before he is indicted again in 2012. And John Brennan, John Kiriakou will say, asked that the effort be reopened to find something to charge him with. And they catch him stumbling because a journalist contacts him named Matthew Cole, who pretends to be writing a book, and he wants names of people so that he can help with a project that involves defense work at Guantanamo Bay, the human rights attorneys that are defending people down there. And so he says, I'm writing a book, which turns out to not be true. And he says, can you tell me who these people are on this page? You know any of these names? He says, no. He says, well, can you tell me about this guy? And he says the name, and John says something that confirms the name, which gets him in trouble and leads him to be prosecuted. And eventually, he does a plea agreement. They want to go after him for Espionage Act offenses, but they get him to plead down to something called the Intelligence Identity Protection Act. And so he does, and he goes to prison in Pennsylvania for 30 months. There's a significant case. They've been using that case as kind of a model to push forward Espionage Act prosecutions. All of these build on top of each other. They get something out of each prosecution. The biggest one with Reality Winner is that they are able to expand the amount of time they could try to impose sentences on people. Then they had CIA whistleblower Jeffrey Sterling, who went to trial. They were able to get 42 months against him in that and put this black CIA whistleblower on trial. And in that case, they tried to force James Risen to take the stand and incriminate his confidential source, whoever those would be.
And he wouldn't.
And he wouldn't. And James Risen refused to take it. But the crucial point here as we start to wind down our conversation is that each of these cases stack, and they add one new thing that the prosecutors can use to make it easier to go after people like Julian Assange.
Yeah. Now, I read with Kiriakou that they dropped all the charges, and then they came up with this other charge called willful detention of national defense, which he didn't even release it. He just had it. And that was like a real stretch. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's not like he even released the information. He just retained the information. I think
I'm a little confused, but I know the kind of charge that you're talking about because and that was actually one thing that they accused Drake of doing, is like retaining the information. So just the act of you having it on your computer at home, even if you haven't made it public, can be something that they come after you for. I think they might have tried to do that to John Kiriakou, but it's a common thing. There are various charges that they try to hit people with. They're not just limited to Espionage Act violations. They'll make claims that like you're stealing the information. They'll come after you for Computer Fraud and Abuse Act violations, that they'll say that you exceeded your authorized access on your computer. And they'll argue that you've committed a theft sometimes, theft of property. So they have all these different crimes associated with the Espionage Act that can create a full slate of offenses to come after and intimidate you into pleading guilty because you feel overwhelmed.
Now, let me ask you something. What reforms, if you were a legislator and you were authoring a series of reforms, like we have the PRO Act, which has all these things to protect workers' rights. And we have the Voting Rights Act, which has all these things to have fair elections and gerrymandering and all. If you were to come up with a suite of bills or reforms, what do you think should be done to stop this political persecution, which is really what it is? It's not legitimate at all. It's political persecution for people that want to expose the crimes of the U.S. government. So what would you be advising a legislator to do? And is any legislator interested in doing these things?
Yeah, actually, Rashida Tlaib, she tried to amend the latest, every year there's the military funding, the National Defense Authorization Act. And she tried to attach an amendment that would have introduced a reform to the Espionage Act so that you could put on a public interest defense if you were accused of it. which means you'd be given the right to take the floor, or you'd be able to stand before the judge and you say, oh, this is why I did what I did. And it could be considered what is known in legal terms as mitigating evidence that could help you reduce the amount of time that you're punished. Or, when you do civil disobedience, or when you engage in activism that is disruptive, sometimes you can claim the necessity defense for what you've done. We've seen that with environmental activists lately who've said, because of the threat of climate change, I had to chain myself to this tractor so I can stop the construction of the oil pipeline. It is a necessity to stop. So you could have whistleblowers who could stand before the judge and say, I had to do this because I was stopping. And then, it becomes whistleblowing when you can detail that your documents show waste, fraud, abuse, and illegality. And you can say that that's the kind of thing I was going to expose. So to me, that's the reform. So pragmatically speaking, that has to be at a minimum what you would get. Some kind of reform to the Espionage Act that says, also I would put into writing that it can't be charged against journalists, that it can't be used to go after the publication of information by journalists. It's already, we're already in an area that historically, the Espionage Act was about, this was the Red Scare. This was anti-communism. This was, we want to make sure that people who work for the government aren't giving information to Soviet Union people and stuff like that. And in these cases that we're talking about, there's no examples of people going directly to like a terrorist group and giving them the documents. We're talking about people who published them on the internet or caused them to be published on the internet or passed them along to news media, which is not the same. That's not what was contemplated by the Espionage Act. Now, I do realize the Espionage Act historically was used to criminalize anti-war dissent. So I understand that it hasn't always been used for the purpose that was discussed by Congress, but still, these are the most basic reforms. But if you want to be very real about what should happen, the whole entire law of the Espionage Act should be abolished. It's well over 100 years old. It has not been updated in order to keep with the time. And if you look at it, it would be better if they just scrapped it entirely. Exactly. But now they've developed all this case law that the Justice Department is dependent upon. And so you created an entrenched system, so to speak, although I recognize it's not really a system, but most people know what I'm talking about, is that you created a way of doing things that it's difficult to unravel. Kind of like how you have like a drone program and they have a way of killing people by committee. Yeah, it's tough to unravel that. The way that they prosecute whistleblowers, this is what they're doing because they can't pass an Official Secrets Act. That's what they wanted to do. Joe Lieberman, after the WikiLeaks disclosures, wanted a law that was called SHIELD Act so that you could punish people who put out documents that named informants, people who were helping the U.S. military, compromised sensitive military secrets, etc. And it never went anywhere. It died. It did not get any serious consideration in the Senate. And in fact, they considered something like this when Bill Clinton was in office, and he refused to sign it and pass it into law. So it didn't go anywhere. Always has had trouble going forward because of the First Amendment. So the way they've circumvented the First Amendment issues is by just manipulating the Espionage Act to go after people.
Right. Now, I titled this episode that Biden is continuing the war on journalists and whistleblowers, and we haven't talked about Biden at all, except for the fact that, he is not dropping the charges against Julian Assange. And these are charges that his former boss, Obama, with all the prosecutions that he didn't even want to prosecute Julian Assange. But I did read that Biden has banned the use of secret orders and subpoenas to get journalist information. Is there anything else good that Biden has done, or is everything else just proceeding apace?
He hasn't done a whole lot to turn a corner from Donald Trump, especially given that he allowed the prosecution of drone whistleblower Daniel Hale to unfold. They put him in a communications management unit, which is the first time for somebody prosecuted under the Espionage Act to basically just say, this is what they told his attorney. He said, he's accused of a crime related to communications, so we're putting him in this restrictive confinement, which means that the FBI is monitoring him. Every conversation he has to have an FBI agent that's available to monitor his phone calls. He's only got like a handful of people he can call, if that, from this facility. Anyone who visits, he's got to stay behind a glass. He can never sit with them in a visiting area. He remains separated and isolated. He gets only I think 2 calls a week. And all of his mail is scrutinized to a degree unlike any other prison. And so this is new. This is new territory that was set under Joe Biden. Whether Joe's the one that instructed them to do it or not is meaningless, because there's a lot that the Justice Department did under Obama that Obama wasn't personally involved in. It just happened while Attorney General Eric Holder was in power. And so the fact that Biden doesn't speak out against it is meaningful to me, and it sends a message that it's acceptable. And Attorney General Merrick Garland isn't stopping this. He's not stopping the prosecution of Julian Assange, so it looks acceptable. There are things that have happened that are somewhat disturbing. We'll save it for another show and to discuss maybe at another date, or you can maybe consider talking with somebody else. But there is a very thorny issue of going after Project Veritas with the raids that were conducted. And I recognize that they're a very ugly, disreputable outfit. But the thing that they went after them for was maybe the least gross, detestable example of their activities in recent memory. And they were given what someone claimed was a copy of Ashley Biden's diary, and they tried to authenticate it, and they couldn't. And so they ended up just turning it over to law enforcement authorities. And then all of a sudden, many months later, after word, the FBI conducted these raids against them, and they're, basically engaged in targeting people in the way that Trump had targeted people who were journalists. And I guess the most crucial point to make, especially knowing the people who are probably watching this broadcast, is that it doesn't matter what the political ideologies are of the people who are being raided under these circumstances and how ugly they are, vile they act as people. What they do to them can then be turned around and done to independent journalists like myself, or people who have advocacy organizations that are maybe doing more admirable work. And again, I think they were pretty cooperative. So the idea is supposed to be, the last point I make is that if you're willing to be cooperative with the US government, then they're supposed to give you some notice that they would like to raid you and seize something from you. Or they're supposed to say, we're considering a subpoena. Could we work out an arrangement maybe to avoid having to take intrusive action? That's what Eric Holder said we should do more of, is we should, let you know if it won't compromise the criminal investigation, which, they're trying to figure out who allegedly stole this diary. It's not Project Veritas. And so let's cooperate. And then it's a good point to end on is that, in fact, Assange and WikiLeaks tried to do this with the Pentagon, tried to do this with the State Department. With the war log files that we started off talking about, they contacted the Pentagon and said, we have this material. This is what journalists do all the time. Can you help us by telling us, what you think we shouldn't publish because we might hurt individuals? And the Pentagon basically replied by saying, you've stolen our documents. We demand you give this back now. something that is never done to the New York Times or the Washington Post.
Well, I remembered what it was. It was your article about Syria, where the whistleblower was forced to, he tried everything, including going to the Senate Armed Services Committee, who ignored it. Now, we don't have time to talk about that. I will put the article in the comments, but your final thoughts on what people watching this who want to see Julian Assange freed should do. Should they contact Biden, Merrick Garland? I mean, what should they be doing?
I actually outlined a whole lot of ideas, or several ideas. I put an article up at my newsletter, the dissenter.org, is called Freeing Julian Assange, What It Will Take to End This Political Case. And I'll just focus on two. I think one, if you can contact your senator or your member of Congress, your representative, and tell them that you care about this, that is important to do. And if they're receiving hundreds of calls from people, especially if you're in their district, then they're going to think that this might be something they need to take a position. And maybe they'll end up being against it. But I actually think if they come out against it, that's helpful, because we could know where these politicians are at, and we can challenge them. Right now, they're being coy and hiding, and they're not giving us much to work with. That's the nature of the Biden administration, refusing to answer any questions, even as they claim to be for press freedom. So we need to confront them and draw them out and figure out why they remain invested in this prosecution. The second thing I'll say is, if any forums or events are happening where you get a chance to do question and answers in public, you should go there and use your time that you get at a microphone to ask a question about Assange and WikiLeaks and the First Amendment and what is happening with the Espionage Act here, and catch them off guard. Let's get them at an honest moment where they're trying to figure out what to say. And we'll see they don't have a talking point, but hopefully we'll get some kind of a response. And the more that we expose the way they are and confront them, I believe that eventually we might be able to make this miserable for them. The ultimate goal has to be that a bunch of people start taking these smaller actions to challenge people and get them to oppose this prosecution. It's what's happening in Australia, and it's what's going on in the UK and some of these other European countries where there's pressure building. And that should happen here. And eventually we want them to do the cost-benefit analysis that they do for anything that's part of their agenda, and for them to determine that it's no longer worth the cost to continue the prosecution against Julian Assange. That's the goal. Until we get to that point where they decide that it's too costly for them to try and make an example of Julian Assange and bring him to the U.S. and put him on trial, then we have work to do, because that's what's going to take in order to end this.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time tonight. Thank you so much for your time focusing on this case and all the other cases. There are very few journalists that are doing this. Somehow I feel that if the mainstream corporate media would do this, it wouldn't be happening. But unfortunately, we know that they're just stenographers for the corporate state and the military industrial complex. Thank you so much. And I want to just tell my audience that the next guest that I will have on my show is most probably going to be David Sirota. And we're going to be talking about the film that he was the co-producer of, called Don't Look Up, which is a scathing satire on climate change and how the government officials and the media are ignoring it. And so hopefully that'll be before the end of the year, because his movie is premiering on Netflix on Christmas Eve. I happen to have seen it in the theaters last Tuesday, and I thought it was a wonderful show. So thank you, Kevin. And I'm sure we'll have you on my show. Hopefully it won't be another 2 years. But I want to say to my viewers, thank you for watching. Share this show and keep fighting.